I just want to thank you so much for having me. I want to thank all the wonderful organizations that's made this event possible. I especially want to thank Philip Jackson of the Black Star Project, Sharon, Richmond, whose determination made this possible, Harold Lucas of the Bronzeville Visitor Information Center. I want to thank him as well, and the Hartzell Memorial Church for allowing this event to be hosted here. No words can truly express how grateful I am for all that you have done to make sure that the message of this book gets heard. When I wrote this book, I knew that the mainstream media wouldn't touch it. I knew that if this message was going to be heard and was going to reach the people who needed it most, it was going to take a grassroots effort. Thank you for making that dream, a reality for me. I'm more hopeful than I have ever been that we will succeed in ending mass incarceration and the history and cycle of racial caste in America. This book is not for everyone. That's the first sentence of the preface to the book, before you get to the introduction. It reads, "This book is not for everyone. I have a specific audience in mind. People who care deeply about racial justice, but who, for any number of reasons, do not yet appreciate the magnitude of the crisis faced by communities of color as a result of mass incarceration." In other words, I'm writing this book for people like me, the person I was more than 10 years ago. I'm also writing it for another audience, those who have been struggling to persuade their friends, neighbors, teachers, relatives, co-workers, or political representatives that something is eerily familiar about the way our criminal justice system operates, something that looks and feels a lot like an era that we supposedly left behind, but have lacked the facts and data to back up their claims. It is my hope and prayer that this book empowers you and allows you to speak your truth with greater conviction, credibility, and courage. Last, but definitely not least, I am writing this book for all those trapped within America's latest caste system. You may be locked up or locked out of mainstream society, but you are not forgotten. In short, I wrote the book for the people in this room. I know everyone here today cares deeply about racial justice and the fate of people of color in the United States. There are many people in this room who are today mourning the loss of loved ones to the prison system. There are people here who have recently been released from prison, struggling to find jobs, find a place to sleep, find a way to feed themselves. There are people in this room who have lost loved ones to violence, police violence, and the violence is going on in our neighborhoods and our communities today. Violence that is the direct and predictable result of this new system of control. And I know there are many people in this room, advocates, who have been struggling, often at great sacrifice, to reform our criminal justice system, provide meaningful educational opportunities for our youth, and mentoring, and efforts to rebuild our communities. So this book is for you. It's not for the so-called mainstream white swing voter. It's not for those who don't yet care about racial justice. It's for those of us who care enough to make a difference for our loved ones, for our children, our children's children, and it's written for all those who have known or suspected that much more is going on in our communities than meets the eye. Those who have suspected that powerful forces have been operating to ensure that people of color remain locked in a permanent second-class status for life. Your suspicions are right. Now, many people today don't want to hear this message. conversations and debates about race, much less racial caste, are treated like, yesterday's news. Political commentators, media pundits, say we've entered into this era of post-racialism. People in the United States and around the world have treated the election of Barack Obama as proof that we have put the final nail in the coffin of Jim Crow, that racial caste is part of our nation's history, but not our present. Well, this book challenges that racial narrative. Racial caste is not dead, it is alive and well in America. The systematic mass incarceration of poor people of color in the United States amounts to a new caste system, one that is specifically tailored to the political, social, and economic circumstances of our time. It is the moral equivalent of Jim Crow. Now, many people, find this claim hard to swallow, particularly those who have never spent time in prison or have been labeled a felon. They say that's absurd. That's absurd. And I myself rejected this idea more than 10 years ago, a fact I now regret. I describe in the introduction to my book that I first encountered the idea that something akin to a racial caste system was operating in the United States more than a decade ago when I was rushing to catch the bus and this bright orange poster caught my eye. It was stapled to a telephone pole. And on it, in large bold print, it read, "The drug war is the new Jim Crow." And it had been posted by a radical group that was organizing the new 3 strikes law that had been passed in California, the expansion of the prison system, police brutality. And it was being held, the meeting was being held at a small community church a few blocks away. And I remember thinking to myself, yeah, the criminal justice system is racist in a lot of ways, but it doesn't help to make such absurd comparisons. People just think you're crazy. And then I crossed the street, ran, hopped on the bus, on my way to my new job as director of the Racial Justice Project, the ACLU. Well, when I began my work at the ACLU, I assumed that the criminal justice system had problems of racial bias, just like all our institutions, in society have problems of racial bias. I assumed it was the same sort of thing. Unconscious bias, conscious bias, racial stereotyping might be found, and it would produce serious consequences. I had been working as an employment discrimination lawyer, suing Fortune 500 companies for gender and race bias, and I thought, well, I'll just take the tools that I've been using over here and apply them to eradicating racial bias in the criminal justice system and work with others to root out racial bias wherever it might rear its ugly head. Well, by the time I left the ACLU, I had come to realize that I was wrong, dead wrong about the criminal justice system. It's not just another institution in our society infected with racial bias, but a different beast entirely. The activists who post that sign on the telephone pole, they weren't crazy, nor were the smattering of activists and formerly incarcerated people around the country who had already begun to connect the dots between mass incarceration and earlier forms of racial control in the United States. So really, quite belatedly, I came to see that mass incarceration had come to function as a stunningly comprehensive and well-disguised system of racial control analogous to Jim Crow. As I explained in the introduction to the book, what has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than the language we use to justify it. In the era of colorblindness, it's no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways in which it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, exclusion from jury service, all suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights, and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. Now, as I mentioned, I didn't come to this conclusion quickly. It took years of working on issues of racial profiling, drug law enforcement in poor communities of color, working on behalf of those who had been victims of police brutality and violence, working alongside those individuals and families who are dealing with all the challenges of quote-unquote re-entry, that I slowly had this process of awakening. And there were a number of events, experiences that caused me to reawaken, but one in particular stands out. There was a young man, young African-American man, could be, no more than about 19 years old, who walked into conference room one day. I had been spending the day interviewing victims of racial profiling. We had already filed a lawsuit against the California Highway Patrol challenging their racial profiling practices in drug law enforcement. And we were looking at the possibility of suing other police departments in the area. This was back when it was actually possible to sue for racial profiling. The Supreme Court pretty much eliminated that possibility. But this was back when it was actually possible to do so. And so I spent the day interviewing one person after another. We had set up a hotline for people to call if they believed they were stopped or targeted by the police on the basis of race, and we had received thousands of calls. So I had spent the day interviewing folks who had experienced discrimination, often brutality at the hands of the police, and in walks this young man with a stack of papers. And he had taken detailed notes of a series of police stops that had occurred to him in his neighborhood in Oakland over a period of about 9 months. Detailed notes, time, dates, locations, names of officers, witnesses, who was present. I thought, my God, this is a dream. You don't get plaintiffs like this very often who can give you names of officers, dates, times, locations, witnesses, the whole nine. He was smart, well-spoken. I thought, he's a dream plaintiff. I kept telling him, I'm so happy you're finally going to be able to help validate, the stories of others in Oakland. And then he said something that made me think, wait, does he have a felony record? Did he say he had a felony? So I said, did you say you had a felony? And he just goes quiet. And he's like, yeah, I have a felony. I have a drug felony. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry. I immediately started apologizing. We're not going to be able to use you as a named plaintiff. There's no way we can use you, if you have a criminal record. The law enforcement will just argue they should be targeting folks like you. The media will have a field day with you. I'm so sorry. I just kept apologizing. We can't use you. And he says, well, I was framed. I was set up. Officers planted drugs on me, and they beat up my friend. He starts telling me the story about how he'd been framed and drugs had been planted on him, and he starts telling me the names of those officers, and I stopped listening. I'm sorry. I cannot take your case. He becomes enraged. He starts yelling at me. He's like, how many of us do you think they are in my neighborhood? Try to go to my neighborhood and find a young black man they haven't gotten to yet. You can't find a young black man who hasn't branded already, who hasn't been gotten to yet. He said, I can't get a job. I'm living at my grandmother's house because I have nowhere to sleep. I can't even get food stamps to feed myself. I can't take care of myself as a man. And I trusted you. I thought you would listen to me. I thought you would hear me. Snatches the papers out of my hand, starts ripping them up, shredding them in front of my face. I can't believe I trusted you. Turns around, walks out, disappears into the elevator. Well, a few months after that, I'm doing a public access television show in his neighborhood. We had been organizing, thousands of people in California to protest then Governor Davis's refusal to sign racial profiling legislation. We were organizing thousands of people for the demonstration. It was a live television show. Show ends, and in he comes, bursts through the doors carrying this dirty potted plant. And he thrusts it in my arms, and he's emotional, saying, I just came to say I'm sorry. I see that you're working out here trying to do something people, and I'm sorry. And he says, I snatched this off my grandmother's front porch. I'm still living at her house. I don't have any money for flowers, but here. And he turns around and runs out. I chase after him. He gets in this broke down car and takes off. Well, several months after that, I opened up the newspaper in my office one day, and what's on the front page? The Oakland Riders police scandal is broken. A gang of police officers in Oakland have been riding around, beating suspects up, planting drugs on him, framing him, and who is named as one of the main officers? The officer he had identified to me as having planted drugs on him and beat up his friend. And at that moment, the light bulb went on. He is right. He is right about me, that I am no better than the police, that I was doing to him what the police had done, that I had stopped listening to him the minute he told me he was a felon, that I could no longer hear him or give him an opportunity to tell his story and share his truth the minute he told me he was a felon. And I started asking myself some questions. Why is it we haven't been able to find a single black man in his neighborhood they haven't gotten to yet? He was right about that. We hadn't been able to find a single young black man in his neighborhood who didn't already have some kind of criminal record, who was over the age of 18. So I started asking myself some hard questions, questioning my assumptions about my own work, but also about the criminal justice system. And I found that most of what I believed, and I thought I knew a lot, most of what I believed about the way the criminal justice system operates was not true. It was just sheer myth. Sheer myth. Back then, I thought that rising crime rates were the cause of mass imprisonment. Not true. I thought the drug war was aimed at rooting out violent kingpins. You know, drug kingpins, violent offenders, drug kingpins. Not true. Not true. Back then, I thought that most illegal drug dealing happened in ghetto communities. Not true. Back then, I thought that black youth were more likely to engage in illegal drug dealing than white youth. Not true. Not true. And I thought that poverty, broken homes, and bad schools explained why so many of our youth were cycling in and out of prisons. And I thought that racial caste was part of our nation's history, not our present. Well, here are a few of the facts that I uncovered in the course of my research that were part of my awakening. More African Americans are under correctional control today, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. In 2004, more black men were disenfranchised than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting laws that explicitly deny the right to vote on the basis of race. Of course, during the Jim Crow era, literacy tests and poll taxes kept black folks from the polls. Today, felon disenfranchisement laws do the job even better. A black child born today has less of a chance of being raised by both parents than a black child born during slavery. This is due in large part to the mass incarceration of black men. Now, an article was just published in The Economist magazine, the leading magazine for economists in the United States and around the world, entitled "How the Mass Incarceration of Black Men Harms Black Women." The article explained that the majority of black women in the U.S. are unmarried, including 70% of professional black women, largely due to the mass incarceration of black men, which not only takes them out of the dating pool during the years in which they would be most likely to marry, but also renders them permanently unemployable and unable to contribute to a family, making it far less likely they will choose to marry even when they fall in love. Now, in some major urban areas, more than half of working-age African-American men have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. In the Chicago area, right here, if you take into account prisoners, the figure is nearly 80% of working-age African-American men These men are part of a growing under-caste, not class, caste. They are permanently locked into an inferior second-class status by law and custom, much like their grandparents or great-grandparents may have been. Now, I find, that when I tell people that I think mass incarceration amounts to a new Jim Crow, people often react with, this shocked disbelief. It's like, how can you say that? Just look at Barack Obama. Just look at Oprah Winfrey. Look at Colin Powell. Look at Condoleezza Rice. The list goes on and on of these extremely successful, wealthy or powerful African Americans who have made it. And that's offered as proof that nothing like a racial caste system could possibly exist in the United States today. Now, I think it's important for us to keep in mind that no caste system in the United States has ever governed all black people. There have always been free blacks and black success stories, even during slavery and Jim Crow. During slavery, there were some black slave owners. Not many, but some. The fact there were some black slave owners didn't mean that slavery was not a racial caste system. During Jim Crow, there were some black lawyers and doctors, not many, but some. Now, the extraordinary nature of individual black achievement in formerly white domains certainly suggests that the old Jim Crow system is dead. But it doesn't necessarily mean the end of racial caste. If history is any guide, it may have just taken a different form. I think any honest observer of American racial history has to acknowledge that the rules and reasons the legal system employs to enforce status relations, well, they evolve and they change as they're challenged. The first chapter of the book, I describe the cyclical rebirths of racial caste in America. Throughout American history, African Americans have repeatedly been controlled through institutions like slavery and Jim Crow that appear to die, but then are reborn in new form, tailored to the needs and constraints of the time. Now, a perfect example of this is the convict leasing system, right? After the collapse of slavery, after the Civil War, African American men were arrested en masse. It was our nation's first prison boom. African American men were targeted and arrested for extremely minor violations like loitering or vagrancy because they had no jobs. They were arrested, sent to prison, and then leased to plantations. Now, the idea was that they were supposed to earn their freedom, but the catch was they could never earn enough to, pay back the plantation owner the costs of their food, shelter, clothing to the plantation owner's satisfaction, so they were effectively re-enslaved. There's a wonderful book called Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackman, which describes how after the Civil War, slavery was recreated in the United States through the criminal justice system. Well, today, I believe the criminal justice system has been used once again in a manner that effectively recreates caste in America. In less than 30 years, the U.S. penal population has exploded from around 300,000 to well over 2 million, quintupled. The U.S. now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world, dwarfing even, highly repressive regimes like Russia or China or Iran. In fact, if we were to go back to the rates of incarceration we had in the 1970s, a time when many civil rights activists actually thought that rates of incarceration were just egregiously high. But if we were to go back to the bad old days of the 1970s, we'd actually have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison today. 4 out of 5. More than 1 million people employed by the criminal justice system would lose their jobs. That's how enormous and deeply entrenched this system has become in an incredibly short period of time. But in my view, the racial dimension is the most striking feature. No other country in the world imprisons so many of its racial or ethnic minorities. It was estimated just several years ago that in D.C., our nation's capital, 3 out of 4 young black men and nearly all those in the poorest neighborhoods could expect to serve time in prison. Similar statistics can be found in many of the black neighborhoods in Chicago and other communities of color throughout the United States. Now, most people assume that, this prison explosion has been driven by crime rates. Crime rates, that's why there's so many black and brown men behind bars. But the truth is, crime rates have remarkably little to do with incarceration rates. Most criminologists and sociologists will acknowledge today that incarceration rates have moved independently of crime rates. Regardless of whether crime rates are going up or down, incarceration rates have consistently soared. Today, crime rates are at historical lows, but our incarceration rates are unprecedented highs. So incarceration rates have consistently soared regardless of whether crime has gone up and down in individual communities or nationwide. So what does explain, this vast new system of control, if not crime rates? Well, it turns out those activists who post that sign on the telephone pole were right. The war on drugs has been the single greatest contributor to the mass incarceration of black and brown people in the United States. Drug convictions accounted for about 2/3 of the increase in the federal system and more than half of the increase in the state system. And that's why there's stop and frisk operations going on in Chicago, New York, LA, where youth are stopped and frisked, their backpacks rifled apart while they're standing on the street corner waiting to catch the school bus. In 2005, for example, 4 out of 5 drug arrests were for possession. Only 1 out of 5 for sales. Contrary to popular belief, most people in state prison for drug offenses have no history of violence or significant selling activity. And in the 1990s, the period of the greatest expansion of the drug war, nearly 80% of the increase was for marijuana possession, drug arrests for marijuana possession, a drug less harmful than alcohol or tobacco, and equally, if not more prevalent, in middle-class white communities and on college campuses as in communities of color. The drug war has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color. Despite studies that have shown for decades that people of color are no more likely to sell or use illegal drugs than whites, and in fact, white youth are more likely to engage in illegal drug dealing than black youth, this drug war has been aimed at rounding up en masse black and brown youth, branding them as felons and criminals at early ages, thus relegating them to a permanent second-class status for life. Now why? You gotta ask why, right? Why is this happening? Why? Well, what we typically hear is that it's all about rates of drug crime. That drug crime is more likely to be found in ghetto communities. We were told back in the mid-1980s, early 1980s, that the reason that President Ronald Reagan was launching this war on drugs was to deal with rising drug crime. But the truth is, in 1982, when President Ronald Reagan officially announced his war on drugs, drug crime was on the decline. It was down. It was a few years before crack hit the streets, first in Los Angeles and later spread to communities of color across America. From the outset, the drug war had almost nothing to do with drugs. It was part of a grand and highly successful Republican Party strategy of using racially coded political appeals, these get-tough appeals on issues of crime and welfare, in order to appeal to poor and working-class whites who were resentful of and disaffected by the gains of the civil rights movement. The history is clear. In the words of H.R. Haldeman, President Nixon's White House Chief of Staff, quote, "The whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to." Well, a few years after the drug war was announced, crack cocaine hit the streets, in inner city communities, and the Reagan administration seized on this development with glee, hiring staff whose job was to publicize inner city crack babies, crack dealers, crack whores, in an effort to build public support for a drug war that had already been declared. Their goal was to make inner city drug use and violence a media sensation, bolstering public support and ensuring that Congress would devote millions of more dollars to it. And the plan worked like a charm. Almost overnight, our television sets were saturated with images of black and brown drug criminals. For nearly a decade, it was impossible to turn on the evening news without, seeing the scenes of black men in handcuffs and drug raids happening in housing projects. And Democrats began competing with Republicans to prove that they could be even tougher on them, with the dark-skinned varieties. In President Clinton's boastful words, President Clinton, who was supposedly our first black president, in President Clinton's words, he said, I can be nicked a lot, but no one can say I'm soft on crime. He made that statement standing outside of the execution of a mentally retarded black man while on the campaign trail in Arkansas. Clinton, though, wasn't satisfied with exploding prison populations. He and the so-called New Democrats, championed the legislation banning, drug felons from public housing, no matter, how minor the offense, denying them basic public benefits, including food stamps for life. Discrimination in virtually every aspect of political, economic, and social life is now perfectly legal once you've been branded a felon. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court has gone along for the ride. The U.S. Supreme Court has, for the most part, turned a blind eye to race discrimination in the criminal justice system. People often ask me, if racial bias is so bad in the criminal justice system, why aren't there more lawsuits, against prosecutors and judges and the police? Why aren't there more lawsuits filed? We should just file some big class action lawsuits against all those who are engaging racial bias. If it's so bad, why isn't that happening? Well, as I describe in some detail in the book, the Supreme Court has closed the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias at every stage of the criminal justice process, from stops and searches to plea bargaining and sentencing. In a series of cases beginning with McCleskey versus Kemp and Armstrong versus the United States, the Supreme Court has essentially said that no matter how overwhelming your statistical evidence, no matter how severe the racial disparities, unless you can present evidence of conscious, intentional racial bias, the kind of evidence that's virtually impossible to come by in the absence of an admission. Today when most everyone knows better than to say, I stopped him because he was black, or I sought the death penalty because he was black. Most officers, most prosecutors, most judges know better than to utter those words. And without evidence of conscious, intentional bias, courthouse doors are closed. You cannot even allege racial bias in the criminal justice system in the United States today. The U.S. Supreme Court has effectively immunized mass incarceration from judicial scrutiny for racial bias, much in the same way that it rallied in defense of slavery and Jim Crow in their time. Now, I want to leave some time so we can have conversation and dialogue here. But I want to just identify a few of the parallels between mass incarceration and Jim Crow. Jim Crow, of course, was a system of laws, rules, practices, and customs that operated to lock African Americans into a permanent second-class status. Well, consider some of the rules and laws and practices that apply to those branded felons and kind of ask yourself, do these remind you of a bygone era? Well, first, denial of the right to vote. 48 states, the District of Columbia, deny prisoners the right to vote. And mind you, most other Western democracies don't. Most other Western democracies actually encourage prisoners to vote and set up voting drives in prison. But not in the United States. We don't believe in full democracy. We bar prisoners from voting rights, and then even after they're released from prison. They can be denied the right to vote for a period of years or the rest of their lives. Other democracies, around the world, no. Almost unheard of for someone released from prison to be denied the right to vote. Exclusion from jury service. One hallmark of the Jim Crow system were, the all-white juries, the automatic exclusion of African Americans from juries, particularly in the South. Well, today, those labeled felons automatically deemed ineligible for jury service. But it's worse than that, because anyone who has ever had a negative experience with law enforcement, and good luck finding many African Americans and poor communities of color who have not yet had a negative experience with law enforcement, any negative experience with law enforcement can justify your automatic removal from a jury in a criminal case. And as a result, the all-white jury in the United States has had a roaring comeback. In many regions, black men, the majority of black men, are ineligible for jury service, and there are all-white juries prevailing in areas where diversity actually reigns. Employment discrimination, perfectly legal, Virtually every job application has that box you gotta check. Doesn't matter if your felony happened last week or 30 years ago. For the rest of your life, you gotta check that box on the employment application. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? Hundreds of professional licenses off limits to felons. In some states, you can't even get a license to be a barber if you've been a felon. Housing discrimination, perfectly legal. Public housing projects, as well as private landlords, free to discriminate against people labeled felons. In fact, you're barred from public housing for a minimum of 5 years when you're released from prison. Where are these folks supposed to go?
Right.
Where are they supposed to go? Families can be evicted from public housing if they allow, a suspected criminal to stay with them. Public benefits, discrimination, perfectly legal. Public benefits, if you're a drug felon, you are ineligible for even food stamps for the rest of your life. Pregnant women, people with HIV and AIDS, doesn't matter how sick or hungry you are, not even food stamps once you've been branded a drug felon. Now imagine you're one of the lucky few who are released from prison and actually manage to get a job. Well, up to 100% of your wages can be garnished. Why? To pay back fees, fines, court costs. Many states now charge prisoners the cost of their imprisonment, accumulated back child support while you were in prison. Up to 100% of your wages can be garnished. What do we expect these folks to do? It's no surprise that about 70% of released prisoners return within 3 years, and the majority who return do so in a matter of months. Because the challenges, the barriers for just surviving on the outside and the making it in the legal economy are so immense. So can this be described as a system of crime control? Can this be described as a system of crime prevention? None of this is any secret to policymakers. They know it's virtually impossible for people released from prison to find a job given the discrimination that's legal against them. They know it's virtually impossible for people to find housing or feed themselves. They know this. Studies have shown that the single greatest predictor of violent crime in any community is joblessness. Joblessness. It's the single greatest predictor. In fact, William Julius Wilson's book, When Work Disappears, describes how the disappearance of work in Chicago in particular, the sudden deindustrialization, the closing of factory jobs, created an environment in which violence was likely to flourish. In fact, if you compare, his studies show, if you compare white jobless men with black jobless men, the racial disparity in violent crime disappears. Let me say that again. Compare white jobless men with black jobless men, racial disparity in violence nearly disappears. But this system is designed to ensure that an enormous population of people defined largely by race will be branded as criminals at extremely young ages often for extremely minor, nonviolent, and drug-related offenses. The same sorts of offenses get ignored in middle-class white communities, branded as criminals, and then ushered into a permanent second-class status, rendered permanently unemployable for life, and then they stand back and ask, why the violence? Why the despair? Why the despair? You create a class of people who are permanently unemployable, locked out, denied education before they go in, denied employment when they get out. Is this a system of crime prevention and control? I say no. In fact, one would be hard-pressed to devise a system better designed to create crime and a permanent group of people thought of as criminals than the one we have today. Our criminal justice system is best understood as a system of racial control, not crime control. As a system of crime control, it makes no sense. But as a system of racial control, it functions extremely well. Extremely well. Now, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? Well, the first thing is we've got to end denial. We have got to awaken. We've got to awaken from our colorblind slumber to the realities of race in America today. We have got to eliminate the shame and stigma associated with being branded a criminal that creates silence in the communities most impacted. Studies show that communities hard hit by mass incarceration, communities where virtually everybody has somebody who's behind bars or recently released from prison, even in those communities, people experience such shame and stigma associated with criminality that they don't want to admit that they did time. They don't want to talk about their son or their brother, their uncle, their niece who's doing time. There are people in this room who have criminal records, who've been in prison, who didn't stand up. They didn't stand up because it felt scary, unsafe to acknowledge publicly criminal history. As long as that remains true, as long as we can't talk openly and honestly about our own criminal history, that of our loved ones, this silence will prevail and we will remain trapped. And we have got to begin to organize, to provide support in our communities for those returning home from prison, provide support to the families who have people behind bars, and begin the work of movement building. Because nothing short of a major social movement has any hope of ending mass incarceration in America. Incarceration just that we had in the 1970s, and I didn't think that was good. But if we were just to go back to those rates of incarceration, we'd have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison today. Prisons across America would close. Most of the new prison construction has been in rural communities. These prisons now serve as the economic base for many of these communities. In the United States, and they are not going out of business without a fight. So, are we willing to do it? Are we willing to stand up? Are we willing to stand up and build the kind of social movement that will ensure not just the end of mass incarceration, but are we willing to end the history in the cycle of racial caste in America? That's our job. I believe we can do it. I believe we can do it. But it is going to take a lot of work, a lot of sacrifice, a lot of sacrifice. And many of us today people who've had opportunities, who are lucky enough to be free or gone to college. We want to turn and look away. We want to turn and look away. We want to make our money, want to buy our house, get our SUV, focused on just making it ourselves. But if history teaches us anything, it's that when people of color, any oppressed people, come together